Lecture 64, Herman Melville.
"Vengeance on a dumb brute," cried Starbuck, "that simply smote thee from blindest instinct. Madness! To be enraged with a dumb thing, Captain Ahab, seems blasphemous." "Hark ye yet again," said Ahab, "the little lower layer. All visible objects, man, are but as pasteboard masks, but in each event, in the living act, the undoubted deed, there some unknown but reasoning thing puts forth the moldings of its features from behind the unreasoning mask. If man will strike, strike through the mask. How can the prisoner reach outside except by thrusting through the wall? To me, the white whale is that wall, shoved near to me. I see in him outrageous strength, with an inscrutable malice sinewing it. That inscrutable thing is chiefly what I hate, and be the white whale agent, or be the white whale principal, I will wreak that hate upon it. Talk not to me of blasphemy, man. I'd strike the sun if it insulted me." Thus speaks Ahab, a scarred, one-legged whaling captain named for a wicked king of ancient Israel. In Herman Melville's Moby Dick, Ahab commands the Pequod, a Nantucket whale ship bound on a 2 years' voyage to the South Pacific. Not long into the voyage, Ahab summons his entire crew to the quarterdeck, nails a bright gold Spanish doubloon to the mainmast, and offers it to the first man who catches sight of a white-headed whale called Moby Dick. Because Moby Dick chewed off one of Ahab's legs, Ahab has sworn everlasting vengeance on him. And he tells the crew that his quest for vengeance must be theirs as well, that they must all swear to hunt and kill the great white whale. This obsessive hunt for a single whale shocks Starbuck, the first mate of the Pequod. As a practical, reasonable, God-fearing man, he wonders how many barrels of marketable oil they will get from a single whale. He's also alarmed by what he takes to be blasphemy in Ahab's quest for vengeance on a dumb brute, because such a quest implies that the whale deliberately maimed him, that behind these savage jaws, the savage jaws of the whale, lurked an evil intelligence, a malevolent mind. Once we credit a dumb beast with intelligence, we abandon the traditional idea that human beings surpass all other creatures on the earth. And with it, perhaps, we might also jettison the idea that the whole universe is ruled by a wise, just, benevolent God. Ahab doesn't give a damn. He doesn't care about traditional ideas or Starbuck's charges of blasphemy. All he cares about is hating and hunting the great white whale. In Moby Dick, Ahab sees inscrutable malice driving outrageous strength. And that inscrutable malice is what he hates. The whale's white head is featureless, like a great blank wall or a pasteboard mask. But if the mask strikes Ahab, he will strike back. He will do everything in his power to penetrate its featureless exterior, to find and kill the malevolence lurking behind it, whether or not the whale is evil in itself or merely the agent of some frightening, sadistic god. Talk not to me of blasphemy, man, says Ahab to Starbuck. I'd strike the sun if it insulted me. In this heated exchange between Ahab and Starbuck, in this passage so dramatic that it feels almost electrically charged, we find the beating heart of Melville's novel. Through the eyes of Starbuck, Ahab looks not only impious and blasphemous, but downright crazy, bent on sacrificing all other gain on this voyage for the sake of catching just one whale. And when Ahab says that he'd strike the sun if it insulted him, he sounds really nuts. But Ahab speaks to something deep inside each of us. Have you ever stubbed your toe on a rock and wanted to smash the rock to pieces? Have you ever cursed the clouds for raining on your picnic, your baseball game, your outdoor party? If you've ever done any of these things, or even felt like doing any of them, then you know at least a little of what Ahab feels. Well, just imagine that feeling magnified. Imagine that instead of stubbing your toe or getting rained on, you had a leg ripped off. Imagine that every day of your life you had to live with a stump where that leg used to be. No way of ever forgetting that traumatic loss. Now, you could, of course, accept the loss and adjust to it with the best artificial leg you could find. That would be the rational thing to do. But if you knew that a particular creature, dumb beast or not, had ripped off your leg, would you not feel the least prick of desire to track down that creature and kill it? If you would, then you know how Ahab feels and why he rouses every member of his crew to swear an oath of allegiance to his hunt for the great white whale. Even Starbuck feels obliged to comply, reluctantly. But there is no reluctance in Ishmael, the narrator of the novel. Even though he's a school teacher who has left his students for the sea, even though he's a well-educated, thoughtful, highly intelligent man, he feels the magnetism of Ahab's quest. He swears his oath with the rest of the crew. He shouts with them. Paradoxically, he's galvanized by the very fearfulness of the beast they have sworn to hunt. A wild, mystical, sympathetical feeling was in me, he says. Ahab's quenchless feud seemed mine. When Herman Melville started writing the epic story of this feud, he was just 30 years old, but already a well-known novelist. Born in New York City in 1819, he came of patrician stock. Grandson of General Peter Gansevoort, a hero of the American Revolution, he was the initially privileged second son of a merchant. But when his father's mismanagement of the business led the family deep into debt, they moved in 1830 to Albany, where Herman entered the academy. When his father died 2 years later, the 12-year-old Herman had to leave school. After 5 years of work as a clerk and a shoe salesman, he returned to the academy for just 1 year, taught school near Pittsfield, Massachusetts, returned to Albany for a time, briefly studied surveying and engineering at nearby Lansingburgh Academy, read literature voraciously, published a couple of fragmentary stories in a newspaper, and then decided, in June of 1839, just before his 20th birthday, he decided to work as a common sailor on a merchant ship bound from Manhattan to Liverpool. Thus began the seagoing adventures that he would recreate again and again in novels that made him famous. A round trip across the Atlantic merely whetted his appetite for grander voyages. Though he returned from Liverpool in September, spent another year teaching school near Albany, and then briefly traveled west in a fruitless search for work, he went to New York in 1840, where he devoured Richard Henry Dana's 2 Years Before the Mast. Written by a man just 4 years older than Melville, this tells the story of Dana's life as a common sailor on a round-trip voyage from Boston to California, rounding each way the stormy, icy, treacherous Cape Horn. Fired in part, perhaps, by the words of Dana, Melville now decided to go to sea again, but this time on a whale ship bound for the Pacific in January 1841. Quite possibly he sought to have the kind of adventures that would make a sensational book, and thus make the name of its author. At sea he found a world of adventure and cultivated his singular talent for storytelling. He sailed as far as the Marquesas Islands, a South Pacific archipelago where the sailors were warmly welcomed by a party of naked young girls. There he deserted the whale ship and spent several weeks with a savage tribe in the Typee Valley, thus gathering material for his first novel, Typee, published in 1846. Further adventures led to further books. Having left the Marquesas by joining the crew of an Australian whaler, he was jailed in Tahiti for his part in a mutiny, but escaped to spend some time on the island and gather material for his second novel, Omoo, which appeared in 1847. Since Typee and Omoo both describe the sexual favors freely offered by native women of the South Seas, Herschel Parker ventures to say that these two books made Melville the first American literary sex symbol. Thus launched in the world of literature, Melville shortly wrote 3 more novels based on his life at sea, Marty and Redburn, both published in 1849, and White Jacket, published early the next year. By 1850, when White Jacket appeared, Melville had married Elizabeth Shaw, daughter of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Massachusetts. In the fall of 1850, they settled on a farm he had bought near Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and that he promptly named Arrowhead. There he wrote much of Moby Dick and cultivated his friendship with another novelist living nearby, Nathaniel Hawthorne, who in 1850 published his own best-known novel, The Scarlet Letter. The following year, on an afternoon in mid-November, it was to Hawthorne that Melville presented a brand new copy of Moby Dick when the two men dined together at the Little Red Inn of Lenox, Massachusetts. And it was to Hawthorne that Melville dedicated the novel, quote, in token of my admiration for his genius, unquote. You may find this a little surprising, for it is hard to imagine two books more different than Hawthorne's novel of adultery in a tight little God-fearing Puritan New England town, and Melville's story of a world-ranging, multiracial, God-defying quest for a great white whale. But a few years before The Scarlet Letter appeared, Hawthorne had produced a collection of stories called Mosses from an Old Manse, and it was these that roused the admiration of Melville. In August of 1850, during a brief stay with Hawthorne and his family, Melville dashed off a fragmentary essay that saluted Hawthorne for the great power of blackness in his stories, for their Calvinistic sense of man's innate depravity and original sin, for their bold revelation of man's capacity for evil. You see, Melville's Hawthorne is not the cheerful, charming writer that many readers imagined him to be. And when Melville dedicates Moby Dick to a writer that he most admires for displaying the great power of blackness, you get some clue to Melville's ambitions for his own book. In writing Moby Dick, Melville stretched his creative powers to the utmost. Though his most recent novels had been well received, he knew that he was still chiefly admired for the graphic colors of Typee, still chiefly renowned as a man who had lived among South Sea cannibals, ravished their women, and come home to tell the captivating tale of his adventures. But by the spring of 1851, Melville felt that he was far more than a storytelling adventurer. Reviewing his growth over the previous 5 years in a letter to Hawthorne, he wrote, "Until I was 25, I had no development at all. For my 25th year, I date my life. 3 weeks have scarcely passed at any time between then and now that I have not unfolded within myself. But I feel that I am now come to the utmost leaf of the bulb, and that shortly the flower must fall to the mold." Fully developed, he was now caught up in a kind of adventure different from anything he had done before, an adventure in storytelling that was all at once nautical, scientific, psychological, and philosophical. When he wrote the words that I've just quoted, he was completing an epic that would chronicle a doomed voyage taken halfway round the globe, dissect a living giant of the sea, and plumb the darkest depths of a human soul, cut loose from all the comforts and constraints of land, a soul at war with all the inscrutable powers of the universe, with everything that threatens to crush, oppress, or annihilate mankind. Moby Dick asks us first of all to imagine landlessness, to imagine forsaking all the comforts of land for the perils of the sea, and thus risking ourselves, both physically and psychologically, on a voyage that will threaten all of our landlocked assumptions. Ishmael, the narrator of this novel, is a one-time schoolmaster, as Melville himself was, a one-time schoolmaster who tells us at the outset that he feels impelled to go to sea. He feels almost suicidally depressed by the constraints of life on land, where men are tied to counters, nailed to benches, clinched by desks. At the same time, he feels irresistibly drawn to the sea, and above all to what he calls the overwhelming idea of the great whale himself. Such a portentous and mysterious monster roused all my curiosity. Ishmael is not frightened by the mystery and terror of the whale. Along with the wildness and remoteness of the seas that it inhabits, the mystery and terror of the whale are precisely what lead him on. But when he boards the whale ship, he's seeking more than thrills. As an intellectual and amateur scientist, he seeks to know the whale, to understand his anatomy, his way of life, and his power, as much as these things can be understood at all. This is one of the many things that distinguish Moby Dick from an ancient epic such as Homer's Odyssey, which Melville surely knew. Though James Joyce would later rewrite the Odyssey as the story of an urban wanderer, Melville is our answer, our American answer to Homer and his fabulous voyager. Having hunted whales in the South Pacific, having savored the perils and pleasures of its exotic islands, and having come home to tell his stories about his adventures, as well as to recycle legends of the whale fishing industry, Melville must have felt something like Homer's wandering Odysseus, who told the story of his own adventures one night at a royal banquet. Also, in writing about one man's hunt for a beast that is far more huge and terrifying than any of the monsters met by Homer's Odysseus, Melville knew that he was writing an epic. But it's an American epic, a story that grows out of the American whaling industry and its relentless hunt for gigantic creatures that actually swam in the sea. America itself, this newborn nation, was the child of the Enlightenment, that great age of intellectual and scientific inquiry that worked so hard to banish the clouds of superstition, to break the stranglehold of inherited ideas, and to build a body of knowledge founded on experiment and fact. Melville's whale, you see, is not a fabulous beast, but a real as any fictional character can be. Melville's story of Moby Dick is based on two factual reports. In 1839, a new and popular New York magazine called The Knickerbocker published the true story of a great white South Pacific whale named Mocha Dick, who defied all efforts to catch him until he was finally killed by the first mate of a whale ship. Besides the story of Mocha Dick, which Melville must have heard or read, we know that he read and studied Owen Chase's riveting eyewitness account of a sperm whale in the Galapagos that deliberately rammed and wrecked a whale ship in November of 1820. So you see, Melville doesn't just invent the story of a great white sperm whale. He works with published reports on actual whales. Furthermore, he takes great pains to classify whales in this novel, to anatomize them, and to explain the distinctive features of the sperm whale, which Melville thought, mistakenly as it happens, to be the largest of all creatures. The reason why this novel is so often interrupted by chapters on whaling and chaetology, the study of whales, is that Melville resolved in every possible way to authenticate his story, to make it scientifically plausible. Granting all that, you may still ask why the great adventure story of Ahab's hunt for the whale is so often interrupted by chapters that look like entries in an encyclopedia, chapters that may strike you as tedious, distracting, or just plain boring. But if you read them carefully, you'll find that these supposedly tedious chapters are studded with jokes, with surprises, with sly cracks. Writing of killer whales in the chapter on chaetology, for instance, Melville says that the whale known as the killer is named rather vaguely. For we are all killers on land and sea, he says, Bonapartes and sharks included. At times, these disquisitions on whales can even get sexy. Describing their mating habits in a footnote, of all things, Melville offers us this wonderful gem. When overflowing with mutual esteem, whales salute more hominum. More hominum means in the manner of human beings. So in other words, whales make love as we do. But can anything be more elegant than Melville's half-Latin phrase for that? Can anything be funnier than the spectacle of whales overflowing with mutual esteem? Aside from being witty, disarming, and sometimes sexy, the explanatory chapters on whales and whaling are essential to the enterprise of the book as a whole. In Moby Dick, Melville sets out to do something intellectually heroic. He tries to comprehend what is ultimately incomprehensible. Writing at one point of the fossil whale, he says, "Give me a condor's quill. Give me Vesuvius' crater for an inkstand. Friends, hold my arms. For in the mere act of penning my thoughts of this Leviathan, they weary me and make me faint with their outreaching comprehensiveness of sweep, as if to include the whole circle of the sciences and all the generations of whales and men and mastodons past, present, and to come, with all the revolving panoramas of empire on earth and throughout the whole universe, not excluding its suburbs." You can almost feel Melville stretching out his arms as he writes these words, struggling to encompass the whole world and having a bit of fun at the same time as he calls for a crater-sized inkwell to write about this enormous subject. But this is the point. He knows that he can never exhaust his subject, never fully explain or define the anatomy of a whale. Seen in a quiet bower, he says, the skeleton of a sperm whale barely suggests the magnitude of the living creature. How vain and foolish, then, thought I, for timid, untraveled man to try to comprehend aright this wondrous wail by merely poring over his dead, attenuated skeleton stretched in the peaceful wood. No. Only in the heart of quickest perils, only when within the eddyings of his angry flukes, only on the profound, unbounded sea can the fully invested whale be truly and livingly found out. No one can truly know the whale from books, pictures, or patient analysis of its bones. To know the whale, Ishmael must leave the land behind him and risk his life at sea, and he very nearly drowns with his shipmates when the Pequod finally goes down, sunk by the very whale it sought to kill. But Ishmael survives to tell the tale of this doomed voyage, and one of the men he mentions briefly is a character who embodies the very spirit of landlessness. Shortly after the Pequod embarks on his long voyage, Ishmael is astounded to see at the helm a tall, strapping Virginian named Bulkington. Having recently met Bulkington in New Bedford, Ishmael knows that he has just returned from a 4 years' voyage. But here he is now, in the very middle of winter, setting out to sea again. The land, writes Ishmael, seemed scorching to his feet. Why? Why doesn't he want to take a break from the sea? Bulkington is like a ship that must fight against the very winds that would drive her back to the lee shore, to land sheltered from the wind. Bulkington risks his life for the sake of his freedom and loses his life when the Pequod goes down. But in Bulkington's irrepressible impulse to sail away again, Ishmael finds a symbol of immortal daring. Addressing the dead man's spirit, he says, "Know ye now, Bulkington, glimpses do ye seem to see of that mortally intolerable truth, that all deep, earnest thinking is but the intrepid effort of the soul to keep the open independence of the sea, while the wildest winds of heaven and earth conspire to cast her on the treacherous, slavish shore? But as in landlessness alone resides the highest truth, shoreless, indefinite is God, so better it is to perish in that howling infinite than be ingloriously dashed upon the lee, even if that were safety. Take heart, O Bulkington, bear thee grimly, demigod, up from the spray of thy ocean perishing, straight up leaps thy apotheosis." Melville himself here leaps up into the stratosphere. In generating this vision of Bulkington as a demigod immortalized by his landlessness and his daring, Melville had no eyewitness accounts, no factual reports. He used his imagination, fed by his voracious reading of literature, ranging from the Bible to Shakespeare, from Milton's Paradise Lost to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and the poetry of Byron, the English romantic poet who died a few months before Melville's 5th birthday and became a hero of his adolescence. In some ways, Melville himself was an American Byron. At the age of 24, when the first 2 cantos of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage were published, Byron awoke to find himself famous for his captivating pictures of life in the Mediterranean, then barely known to most of his English readers. By June of 1847, when he was not yet 29, Melville had made himself famous for his 2 novels of life in the South Seas, Typee and Omu. But Melville did not wish to relive the life of Byron. For purposes of fiction, what fascinated Melville was the figure of the Byronic hero, epitomized by the character in Byron's play Manfred. Manfred is dark, brooding, mysterious, guilt-ridden, alienated, proud, restless, and indomitably defiant. Some of these qualities can be found in Melville's Bulkington, who is certainly both mysterious and restlessness. But Bulkington was not dark enough to exemplify the great power of blackness, which is clearly what Melville sought to explore in his novel. What he needed for his hero was a figure who combined the brooding restlessness of the Byronic hero with the God-hating rage of Milton's Satan and his insatiable quest for revenge. Along with tinctures of Shakespeare's King Lear, Mary Shelley's Dr. Frankenstein, and the biblical story of the original Ahab, the wicked king of ancient Israel. These are the qualities that Melville pours into the maimed and magnificent hero of his book, Captain Ahab. Ahab is a knot of contradictions. absolutely determined to make every member of his crew serve his quest for Moby Dick. He sounds at times like a dictator, a tyrant, a czar. But as we've seen already, he rules his men not so much by giving them orders as by igniting their passion, by firing their sympathies, by making them eagerly embrace his own rage and lust for revenge on the great white whale. Ishmael himself, as we have already seen, is captivated by Ahab and thrilled by his vow of vengeance on Moby Dick. A wild, mystical, sympathetical feeling was in me, he says. Ahab's quenchless feud seemed mine. If Ahab rules his men with an iron hand, it's precisely and paradoxically because he's made them believe that he personifies defiance of the universe. Remember his claim that he would strike the sun if it insulted him? He actually finds a way of doing so. As the ship nears the equator one day, he calculates their latitude by sighting the position of the sun with an instrument called a quadrant. But since the sun can tell him only where he is, not where to find Moby Dick, he scornfully dashes the quadrant to the deck, vowing to navigate henceforth by level ship's compass. Yet soon afterwards, when a thunderstorm reverses the polarity of the ship's two compasses, the sun rises in what the compasses call the west, and the sun's position tells him that his compasses are wrong. Only after making a new compass can he reclaim his would-be mastery. When the sun's position now confirms the rightness of his new compass, he triumphantly declares, "The sun is east, and that compass swears to it." But it is, of course, the sun that ratifies the compass, not the other way around. Even after scornfully rejecting the guidance of the sun, Ahab cannot help relying on it. Ahab's all-defying bravado cannot mask his submission to forces beyond his control. He will not serve any god. He will not yield to any force, no matter how intimidating. He will not give up his quest. Alone in his cabin after rousing all of his crew, he dares the gods themselves to knock him down again, as they have once before, or to swerve him. "Swerve me, ye cannot swerve me. The path to my fixed purpose is laid with iron rails, whereon my soul is grooved to run." But notice Ahab's metaphor. For all his defiance of authority, even supernatural authority, he's calling himself, his very soul, a railroad car. His soul is grooved to run on tracks, just like a train. So it's almost as though he feels that his purpose, his quest for vengeance, is something that tells him where to go, something he has no power to resist or change. Ahab is hardly a free man. Talking with Starbuck on a calm, beautiful morning, just before he finally catches sight of the great white whale, he broods over the hardships and loneliness of his 40 years at sea, the slavery of solitary command, and the nameless compulsion that drives him onward. "What is it?" he asks. "What hidden Lord and Master and cruel, remorseless Emperor commands me, that against all natural lovings and longings I so keep pushing and crowding and jamming myself on all the time, recklessly making me ready to do what in my own proper, natural heart I durst not so much as dare? Is Ahab Ahab? Is it I, God, or who that lifts this arm?" The novel gives us no clear answer. But if it's God that drives Ahab, it is a very dark God. In the course of this novel, we gradually discover that he may have sold his soul, like Faust, to dark forces, that he has tied his faith in revenge to a treacherously vague prophecy made by a mysterious, fire-worshipping Parsi, a follower of the ancient Persian prophet Zoroaster. To the very end, Ahab clings to the Parsi's prophecy, believing that it promises victory over Moby Dick. Even after the white whale splits his boat in two, dumps him in the water, splinters his ivory leg, and carries off the Parsi, who is caught up in a whale line, even then Ahab will not give up because he feels that he has no choice. When Starbuck warns him that it's suicidal as well as blasphemous to hunt the whale any further, Ahab says, "This whole act's immutably decreed. Fool, I am the fate's lieutenant. I act under orders. Look thou, underling, that thou obeyest mine." At once driving and driven, tyrannical and enslaved, Ahab throbs with conflict. If tragedy is the suffering of a soul that can suffer greatly, as Edith Hamilton says, then Ahab is quintessentially tragic, a tragic hero as well as an epic one. However insane and overbearing and even diabolical he may be, Ahab speaks to us from the depths of his hatred and pain, and he speaks for whatever there is in us that cries out against the seemingly inexorable prospect of annihilation, obliteration, and death. If I had to sum up both Ahab and Melville himself in a single sentence, I would quote what Ahab says in the midst of the lightning storm. Taking in his own hand the links of the lightning rod that is attached to the mast of the ship, he dares the fire to consume him and defiantly proclaims, "In the midst of the personified impersonal, a personality stands here." It is impossible to overstate the force of the personality Melville has created. Though Ahab is finally caught by the line of his own harpoon and carried off by the great white whale, he lives again each time we read Moby Dick, which remains the greatest achievement of Herman Melville.